Thank you. People love to come up and tell me that they love what we've done with the farm. But what they don't realize is that that messes up with my head and puts me in kind of a time warp. And they suddenly, instead of talking to the person, I'm thinking about apple trees that I knew where they were when I was a kid. And I'm thinking about these hen houses that have these funky shades in the windows that were related to what Tom was saying about World War II. They were blackout curtains that you would pull down so that the invading enemy wouldn't know that there were lights on down there. And I see my grandfather carrying a milk pail and walking across the street to milk 2 cows in the barn. And I try to envision my father as a young child being excited about planting new apple trees in the long rows out behind the barn. It is a tremendous gift to shift a farm from one generation to the next. My wife and I were the receivers of such a gift from my parents, Jack and Adeline Snell, and our daughter Carolyn is currently growing her cut flower and flower design business now. But the transfer of the farm from my grandfather to my father is one that haunts me now, and it is in many ways tragic. There are not really any heroes or villains in the story. There are really just two very strong characters looking at the same farm from two very different points of view. But to understand that, you need to meet these characters. My grandfather was Henry Snell. My father was John Snell Sr., known as Jack Snell. Henry was not a farmer. He came to farming almost for health reasons. He was a bookkeeper, accountant by trade. He was very sick 100 years ago at Fort Devens in the Spanish flu. When he got out of the Army, he was out as a supply sergeant. He went to work for International Paper up in northern Maine as a company clerk and paymaster. He would travel from logging camp to logging camp, sometimes by canoe and with a French-Canadian guide. Later on, he had more health problems. He contracted tuberculosis in 1925, and the strategy for tuberculosis in those days was fresh air and bed rest. So he and his wife Ruth sold some stock that they had and purchased the old Scribner farm in Buxton, Maine. His uncle lived up the street and knew that they were settling the Scribner estate and helped them with the sale. Henry's recovery from tuberculosis took about a year in bed in the front room of that farmhouse with the windows open. My grandmother Ruth had knitted him this special hat. He was bald, and so he wore the hat because of the cold breezes blowing through the room. But when he recovered, he went to raising laying hens, which would be for eggs, and he also raised apples. Henry understood laying hens from his bookkeeping background. He liked the fact that they were very predictable and that it was a 52-week-a-year crop. I don't really think he ever understood the apple business. He saw it as very seasonal and very risky. Uh, he saw the farm not as a farm, but he saw it more as a lifeboat. For him, it had been like a medical lifeboat and also an economic lifeboat. They were essentially self-sufficient. It didn't take much cash to keep them going through the Depression. They raised their own food, they cut their own firewood, and they cut their own hay. But he went on and would reflect on the farm and was quite proud of it. He would sit and smoke his pipe. He smoked George Washington tobacco and would inhale, but he really only had one good lung because of the tuberculosis. But he was a tough cutter, and he lived to be 93. My father was born on the farm in 1928. His interest was apples. He hated poultry, and he was convinced that the only reason the hens made money was, in Henry's books, was the donated labor of his and his 4 other brothers, listed as a non-cash transaction. But my father grew up planting apple trees. This was the 30s, and there had been a tremendous freeze in New England in 1934, and it killed the predominant variety, which was Baldwin's. A lot of those trees died that year, so orchardists all over New England were replanting their orchards, and people were excited. They were replanting them with this new hot variety, which was Macintosh, and that would be analogous to planting Honeycrisp today. And so Jack's interest was apples. In high school, he took agricultural classes and had a vision of expanding the farm on the apple side and phasing out the poultry side. But, and then he graduated from high school. He had to drop out for a year because his 2 older brothers were away at the war. They were short on labor. So what would have been his senior year, he dropped out, worked on the farm for a year. The war ended, and he went back and graduated with a class behind him. At that point, he decided to farm full-time with my grandfather in sort of a father-son arrangement where the farm would eventually shift to him. But the dynamic of those 2 strong forces looking at this farm from 2 different points of view was extremely frustrating from my father's point of view and somewhat disruptive from my grandfather's point of view. And while my father was working there, the farm was always dangled ahead of him as, someday this will all be yours. But what happened is it kept getting further and further along. And it was never really ever shifted to him until the late 80s, actually. My father was 60 years old. And by the time it was shifted to him, my father no longer had the energy to dive into it and sort of push that rock up the hill. So shortly thereafter, the farm was shifted to my wife Ramona and myself. And at that time, this would have been the late 70s, we had started farming. And that was the beginning of the resurgence of selling direct. When we first started going to farmers markets, the Portland Farmers Market had never stopped. The Brunswick Farmers Market, where Tom was, had just started. And I think we went to the Saco Farmers Market, and that was like the 3rd one in the state. But going back, selling direct to the customers was a big trend that was starting in the 70s. And if you know my wife, she's a tremendous manager and a tremendous marketer and probably a way better farmer than I am, which is helpful if you're looking to make changes and to become successful. But the bittersweet part about this is that the more successful we appear to be, the more I think about how the farm's management sort of skipped my father's generation, but a lot of the success that we are having now is the result of him being able to keep the farm going. By rights, it should have died a natural death probably in the 70s, but at that point, my grandparents were collecting Social Security, and my mother went back to work for the government. She worked for Farmers Home. And both of these things are actually quite ironic because both my parents and my grandparents were staunch Republicans, and both of those programs were Roosevelt, outgrowths of Roosevelt New Deal programs. But those things sort of kept the farm, it was stagnant, but it kept it going and kept it from dying. But so now when somebody says they like what we've done with the farm, I think back and you can see some of the things that float through my head as I'm thinking about that. Thank you very much.